Welcome to the final round. I'm your host, Matthew Holt, Chief Operating Officer of CG Analytics and Vice President of Business Development for CG Technology. Stephan Bonnar had something come up last minute this week and no one-kick Nick, so looks like I'm riding solo here for UFC 215. Big pay-per-view this weekend. Pound for pound, number one, Mighty Mouse Johnson, looking to break that title defense record against Ray Borg. And one of the biggest spreads we've seen in a main event here in a long time in the UFC, as Demetrious Johnson, currently a minus 1,100 favorite, 7-1 coming back on Ray Borg. This is an interesting fight because while I don't necessarily think it's the best matchup at flyweight, or I don't necessarily think it's a great fight, I don't think it's as wide a gap as minus 1,100, plus 700. So in that respect, look, if you force me to make a bet on this fight, I would probably take the plus 700 with Ray Borg. And here's the reasons why. While Mighty Mouse Johnson has been the most dominating champion and the only champion we've ever seen at 125 pounds in the UFC, he's completely cleared out the division, beating Joseph Benavidez twice, Ian McCall, Henry Cejudo, Wilson Heiss, John Dodson twice. And there's not a lot of challengers left, so I understand why this Ray Borg fight might be happening, although I think most of us would agree that Sergio Pettis is probably the most deserving number one contender at the flyweight division. Here we are with Ray Borg, and there are a few things going for Ray Borg if he comfortably makes weight. So Ray Borg in the past has had a lot of troubles making 125, but let's just assume that he's had a lot of time to prepare for this title fight, and that he's going to find a way to comfortably make weight. Not just make weight, but comfortably make weight, because we don't want to see a drained Ray Borg in this fight, because a drained Ray Borg is going to have no shot. But if Ray Borg does make weight comfortably in this fight, look, he's only 24 years old. He's 5-2 in the UFC. He has 2 straight wins, including beating Jussier da Silva in his last fight. I thought he was really dominant against Luis Smolka in the fight before that. So a lot of things going for Ray Borg, and one of the things we talk about on this show a lot of times is that big jump in class and in performance that a guy can make from when he's 21 years old, 22 years old, to 23, 24, once he gets to that 13, 15, 16 fight mark where he has some fights under his belt. At this point now, Borg, only 24 years old, and he has 7 fights alone in the UFC, 13 fights overall. It's not completely out of the question that Ray Borg could take a big step forward here and put a big performance together here and maybe upset the pound-for-pound champion. I think it's a stretch, but I certainly don't want to lay 1,100 in this fight. I took a look at the total, 4.5, the over-under, minus 110 either way. So you're gonna lay the same juice either way, over or under. Interestingly enough, Demetrious Johnson in his 12 fights at flyweight, 6 decision wins, 6 finishes. So you're getting basically a dead pick 'em on whether he goes the distance or not. And it really hasn't mattered an opponent. Joseph Benavidez was a clear number one contender when he fought Demetrious Johnson the second time, and Johnson knocked him out. He knocked out Henry Cejudo, who again was the clear number one contender at the time, and he's gone the distance with some guys that have been considered way lesser than him and Tim Elliott. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here as far as the total. I don't really have a big prediction either way. I do think the one thing Ray Borg has going for him in this fight is that, Demetrious Johnson's best strength is probably his wrestling. We saw it against Elliott. We've seen it several times, how dominant Demetrious Johnson's wrestling can be. But Ray Borg is really, really strong in the scrambles, and he might be the biggest, strongest flyweight Demetrious Johnson has ever faced. And he's going to, he's significantly younger, 7 years younger than DJ at 31. It's hard to imagine DJ slowing down. But if DJ does look past him, possibility here we could see a big upset. I think you can only bet one way. It's one of those fights. Maybe you throw a small bet on the dog, because I wouldn't want to be sweating out Demetrious Johnson in this fight. 3,300 to make 1,000 or make 3,300. I'm sorry, 3,300 to make 300 kind of bets here. 33,000 to make 1,000. That's not the kind of situation we want to be in here. So Yeah, I mean, I don't really love Ray Borg in this situation. It's unfortunate that the fight is happening, but I don't think you can lay 1,100 with Demetrious Johnson because I actually think the fight's a little closer. Moving on to the co-main event, we finally get the rematch here. Amanda Nunes, Valentina Shevchenko, both of these women 29 years old. Obviously, Amanda Nunes pulled out of the last fight. She got ill after having a really bad weight cut the next day. And it's what's really interesting to me, and if you're going to make money long-term in sports betting, you have to find inherent value. And the fact that the first fight closed at Nunes minus 125, she pulls out. They scheduled the fight for 2 months later, and now it's Shevchenko minus 125, means to me that there's probably inherent value on Amanda Nunes. I mean, what's changed in 2 months? Yes, people dislike Amanda Nunes more than they did before because she pulled out on fight night, because she made excuses, because Dana White threw her under the bus a little bit, saying, look, a lot of it was mental. She could have fought. She just wasn't 100%. A lot of fighters fight at less than 100%. Well, Amanda Nunes chose not to fight at 100%, but it doesn't mean she's not going to be 100% for this fight. And what we've seen is when Amanda Nunes is 100%, she is a devastating striker. 13 out of her 14 wins by way of finish. That is a 93% finish rate for Amanda Nunes. Coincidentally, the only win on her resume in her entire career that she actually went to the scorecards to was against Valentina Shevchenko. And I like it when we have an earlier recent fight between two fighters to show us kind of what happened. You know, I used the Ryan Bader, Phil Davis as a perfect example. Ryan Bader outpointed him the first time. Everybody jumped all over Phil Davis the second time they fought. I jumped on Ryan Bader as a dog. I said, what's going to be different this time? We saw Ryan Bader again outpoint Phil Davis the second time in another boring fight. So I ask the people that are backing Valentina Shevchenko here, what's going to be different this time? I understand you don't like Amanda Nunes. I understand that there's some ill feelings, toward everything about her pulling out on fight night. But the simple fact is she almost finished Valentina Shevchenko in the first round. The first time they fought, she absolutely killed her. And when two fighters are dead fresh, that's kind of the best perspective of what happens when these two fighters meet fresh in the octagon. And what happened the first time is Amanda Nunes put it on Valentina Shevchenko. Understandably, Nunes did fade later in that fight and Shevchenko came on, but that doesn't also guarantee that Nunes will fade again. And getting beat up in the octagon early to make your opponent fade, this isn't boxing. That's not always the best strategy. I'm definitely all over Amanda Nunes here. I do have a bet on her already. I may bet her again, especially if I continue to get plus money. To me, just the simple fact that she closed a favorite last time, they ended up canceling the fight night. Nothing's changed since then. Now she's an underdog. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And she really looked the better of the two the first time they fought. She is a devastating striker. I think Valentina Shevchenko is strong. I think she's tough. I think if she can make it out of those first 2 rounds, then it is possible that this fight ends up being close on the scorecards. But one thing to consider, as we've had some, fighters die in MMA octagon, or not octagons, but MMA rings or cages around the world. We've had some boxers die from injuries this year. And what we're seeing, and we saw it in the Mayweather-McGregor fight, referees are a little bit quicker to stop fights than they were a couple years ago. Fighter safety, a big issue. Conor McGregor never went down in that fight when it got stopped. So don't be surprised if Amanda Nunes comes out and blitzes Valentina Shevchenko early like she did in the first fight. Maybe this time she actually gets the stoppage. Only one way to look here, I think, all the value on the champion, Amanda Nunes. Moving down to the main card, this is a really interesting matchup to me, and one that's getting a lot of notoriety is Neil Magny versus former lightweight champion of the world, Rafael dos Anjos. Rafael dos Anjos just under a 2-1 favorite here, currently sitting at minus 190 at the CGT Sportsbook at the Palms with a total of 2.5 over minus 220. This fight is interesting on a lot of perspectives just from a matchup basis. Look, Rafael dos Anjos has fought in the UFC. Now, I have to look it up. It's so many fights he's had in the UFC. 22 fights in the octagon for Rafael dos Anjos. And Stephan and I always talk about fighter miles. We saw it with Shogun Rua, it wasn't an age issue. It was just a miles issue. We've seen it with Lyoto Machida. We've seen it with a lot of fighters in the past, even Chuck Liddell at the end, is when you have so many of these grueling fights in the octagon, it takes a bigger toll than the actual years of your age. And Rafael Dos Anjos, only 32 years old, but 22 fights in the UFC. From 2012 to 2015, Rafael Dos Anjos won 10 of 11 fights in the octagon. The only loss to Khabib, won the UFC lightweight title from Anthony Pettis, went on and defended it against Cowboy Cerrone. Then he got knocked out by Eddie Alvarez. And then the fight that I think is most critical when handicapping this fight, then he went on to fight Tony Ferguson. And Tony Ferguson was able to use height advantages, reach advantages to be the superior striker and keep Rafael Dos Anjos at range all day long in that fight. And again, what we're going to see here in Neil Magny, if you thought Tony Ferguson was big at lightweight, Neil Magny is huge at welterweight. 6'3" welterweight. He is one of the tallest welterweights in all of the UFC. A guy at 6'3" to make 170 pounds. If he follows that same Tony Ferguson game plan here, use that striking, use that range, keep Rafael Dos Anjos kind of on his toes back there, then this could be a really long night for Rafael Dos Anjos. And if he goes to the ground, Neil Magny has one of those MMA bodies at 6'3". Really tall, really long, really good at submission. So I think there's a lot of different ways for Neil Magny to win this fight. I think the only way Rafael Dos Anjos probably wins this fight is to get inside that reach, hit Neil Magny with some big shots. We've seen Magny get hurt and knocked out before, including just 2 fights ago where he got knocked out, blitzed in the first round against Lorenz Larkin. But I think if Rafael Dos Anjos isn't able to solve that distance issue really early, it could be a really long night. And look, you can get Neil Magny anywhere from plus 170, plus 165 to plus 175 range. That's almost 2-1 on your money in a fight that really feels like a pick'em. You get the bigger, stronger, younger guy, more established in the division, and a matchup nightmare for Rafael Dos Anjos at almost 2-1 odds. Neil Magny feels like an auto bet for me here in this situation. Next fight on the main card, a really interesting fight. Gilbert Melendez versus Jeremy Stephens, and this is a good one, and I have a feeling here that the loser of this fight, it's not one of those loser leaves the UFC matches, but it most certainly could be here. Is the problem with a guy like Gilbert Melendez, the former Strikeforce champion coming into the UFC, is he's only 1-4 since he came to the UFC, since the UFC takeover of Strikeforce. And the problem with Gilbert Melendez is he makes 6 figures a fight. And when you make 6 figures a fight and don't win any fights, the UFC isn't going to be inclined to keep you very long just because they can't make money off you if you can't win fights. And Gilbert Melendez is a guy they put on an Ultimate Fighter show, had him coaching against Anthony Pettis. He lost that fight, lost to Benson Henderson. The only win, in fact, Gilbert Melendez has in the UFC was against Diego Nightmare Sanchez in a fight that was way closer than it should have been. So this is an interesting fight here. Jeremy Stephens coming back up to a lightweight after trying featherweight for a while. Extremely unsuccessful down there for Jeremy Stephens. And Jeremy Stephens is another one of those guys. He's a big name. He's been around forever. But when you look at the stats, they're not very good. 24 fights in the UFC for Jeremy Stephens. In fact, his first fight in the UFC was 10 years ago, 2007, against Dean Thomas. The same Dean Thomas that we now see on those Dana White looking for a fight videos if you go on Fight Pass. Yeah, that Dean Thomas, that's who Jeremy Stephens made his UFC debut against way back in 2007. But when you look at Stephens' numbers, 11-13 in the UFC, somehow this guy is always ranked. He always gets big fights, but a sub-500 record in the UFC for a guy who's fought 24 times. I think here the name carries a little more weight than the actual pedigree and technique in the cage. Look, at 35 years old and a 1-4 record in the UFC, Gilbert Melendez has to win this fight. I think we're going to see a desperate Gilbert Melendez, an aggressive Gilbert Melendez. He has been on the wrong side of some really close decisions. Split decision loss to Benson Henderson, really close decision loss to Anthony Pettis. Gilbert Melendez, a tough loss to Eddie Alvarez. He has to get the job done here. Otherwise, he's probably going to be cut, because if you're 1-5 in the UFC and your only win is against Diego Nightmare Sanchez, the UFC is probably not going to continue to pay a 35, 36-year-old who's 1-5, 6 figures per fight. So I think we're going to see a really aggressive, really strong Gilbert Melendez in this fight. He's going to be the bigger guy. He's going to have superior wrestling in this fight. The power advantage probably lies with Jeremy Stephens. But in Jeremy Stephens, we've seen a guy who's lost 3 of his last 4 fights. When he doesn't land that big power punch, he loses. His only win in his last 4, I think, was that come-from-behind win against Dennis Bermudez, where he was getting absolutely destroyed, came back and hit Dennis Bermudez with that huge knee and knocked him out. But look, when Jeremy Stephens doesn't land those bomb power shots, he's not winning fights lately. I think this is Gilbert Melendez's fight to lose, and because he's 1-4 in the UFC, we're actually getting an amazing value here as a pick'em. I mean, this is a guy who was fighting for the UFC title a couple of years ago against Anthony Pettis, against Benson Henderson. Now all of a sudden he's a pick'em with Jeremy Stephens. I know he's 35. Maybe he's on the wrong side of the mountain as far as his career trajectory, but this feels like a desperation spot for Melendez where he gets the job done. This is another bet-on fight for me. Bet on Gilbert Melendez basically at a pick'em price, and if you shop around, you can get -105, maybe even money on Melendez, although I have seen that line start to turn the corner where most of the money now is showing up on Melendez, and the line's definitely trending that way. Moving on down the card, the last fight on the main card here, Sara McMann, the old wrestler, against undefeated newcomer Ketlen Vieira. And this is a really interesting fight because of the odds. Again, Sara McMann, a -260 favorite here, total 2.5 over -280 at the CGT Sportsbook here at the Palms Resort Casino in Las Vegas. And McMahon's one of those fighters, she's really tricky to figure out, right? 36 years old at this point, doesn't have a lot of punching power, only 1 knockout on her resume, but maybe the best, if not one of the top 3 wrestlers ever in female MMA, at least the female MMA in the UFC. But she's found a lot of ways to lose fights against elite opponents. You know, lost to Rousey, lost to Tate, lost to Amanda Nunes, but now she's on a 3-fight winning streak, actually, against much lesser opponents. And the question, I guess, is at 36 years old, what does Sara McMann have left in the tank? And on the other side of it, we bring in a newcomer here who we don't know a ton about. In Vieira, she's only 26 years old, so a decade age difference here. McMann, 36, Vieira, 26. She's undefeated, 8-0. She fights for a major gym out of Brazil. In fact, the same gym, is a lot of famous fighters, including Jose Aldo, so she's at a major gym in Brazil. And look, she's 2-0 in the UFC. Both of her wins come by decision, but what I did like is she has 5 finishes and 8 wins, and prior to coming to the UFC, she had 5 finishes and 6 wins. So this is a girl who ripped through the regional circuit in Brazil, not just winning fights, but destroying opponents there and finishing them at a fairly good rate. Since she stepped up in class in the UFC, she's had to go to the judges' scorecards in both of her fights. But I think that she could probably outwork Sara McMann here, and this is one of those classic grappler versus striker matchups. Even though Vieira looks to be good on the ground, she's a really strong Brazilian jiu-jitsu game here. You don't want to end up on the bottom against Sara McMann. So I definitely don't want to lay the price at 260 with Sara McMann, but I'm certainly intrigued to take +220 with Vieira here, because I think if she keeps the fight standing, she's probably going to be able to outwork McMann. McMann doesn't have a big output of punches on her feet. And even if it does go to the ground, I think there's a chance that an over-aggressive McMann on the ground could get caught in a submission. So is Sara McMann a deserved favorite here? She certainly has the better resume, but she's also failed every time she stepped up in class in the UFC. As we said, lost to Tate, lost to Rousey, lost to Nunes. I think there's a little value here. Maybe she's a little overpriced now that she's on that 3-fight win streak. I'm going to take the 10-year-old younger young lady here in Vieira at +220 and hope that she can outwork Sara McMann. One of the fights that's been getting a lot of betting handle here, the feature on the prelim card, Yair Latifi against Tyson Pedro, and this line completely flip-flopped. If you looked at the offshore market and looked at our book as well, the line opened -140 Latifi, and for good reason. His resume's fantastic. Latifi now 3-1 his last 4 fights in the UFC. He has 8 fights in the UFC under his belt, has a power puncher, a great wrestling. We've seen him in there with some big names, including Gegard Mousasi, Jan Blachowicz. And on the other side, we have sort of an unknown in Tyson Pedro, 26 years old, 6-0, 2-0 in the UFC. All 6 wins coming by finish. His 2 wins in the UFC against Khalil Roundtree and Paul Craig. Not really. They're both very lower level guys. But at 6-0 and 6 finishes at only 26 years old, this guy's worth, keeping an eye on. But at this point, this feels like a really big jump up in class. And the fact that at minus 140, I wasn't really interested in betting on Yair Latifi. It seemed like, yeah, he was the deserved favorite. And let's see what this young kid can do. But now that this line has flip-flopped to Tyson Pedro minus 140, I'm actually very interested in betting Yair Latifi in this fight. Here's a really great stat for this fight. Yair Latifi, 0-3 against opponents who were ranked at the time when he fought him in the UFC, but 5-0 against unranked opponents when he fights him in the UFC. This is a guy who gets the job done when he's supposed to get the job done. And this is a spot on paper, at least, where it feels like Latifi, the experienced guy, the guy that's been in there with the ranked opponents, is supposed to get the job done. But the matchup, again, is stylistically a little bit strange. So you have a really big, tall, strong light heavyweight in Tyson Pedro, against a really short, stocky, a gargantuanly built Yair Latifi. So it'll be interesting for me to see if can Tyson Pedro use that range. Because if it goes to the clinch in the wrestling, Yair Latifi's really strong. If he gets on top of you, it's tough to get him off. And if he gets inside that range, he has massive power in both hands and can knock you out. So I think it's an interesting fight. It's one that I'm going to bet, especially now that Yair Latifi is an underdog. If you can get Latifi at plus 135 or better, I certainly recommend making a play on him. And the total in this fight is also seen. I mean, the total and the line movement in this fight would both indicate to you that everyone believes Tyson Pedro is going to win this fight by knockout, but I'm not quite sure that's the case. Don't be surprised if Yair Latifi hangs around for a little bit and doesn't. So I wouldn't make a play on the under here. I wouldn't be surprised at plus money if Latifi can hang around a little bit. And I actually love him to win this fight at plus money. This is a play on fight for me here. Another one on the undercard that I'm really interested in is Rick Glenn, former World Series of Fighting standout, came over to the UFC, 1-1 in the UFC, taking on newcomer, undefeated 10-0 Gavin Tucker. And this is a fight, when I made my odds, when this fight was announced a couple weeks ago, I made it Gavin Tucker about minus 140, minus 150. This line is up to Gavin Tucker minus 300. And I think a lot of people who don't watch, there's sort of 2 schools in MMA here. There's the school where everyone just watches UFC and Bellator, and then there's the diehard MMA group, or people like me who try to make money off this sport, betting on this sport, who watch WSOF, who watch LFA, and who watch all these organizations, Bama and everything, to see these guys up and coming and the level of opposition they face. And while Rick Glenn only has 2 fights in the UFC, he has fought a lot of tough guys. This is a guy who fought Lance Palmer for the title in World Series of Fighting, fought Georgi Karakian, who's a longtime Bellator standout, knocked him out, made Georgi quit, and Georgi's a really talented guy. Look, if you've never seen Rick Glenn fight, picture Cole Miller, who can punch hard. He's the same type of guy, a 6-foot-tall featherweight, 6 foot tall, fighting at 145 pounds, has that same body frame as Cole Miller, except he actually turns on his punches, and he uses that tall, lanky range to land strikes. 10 knockouts and 19 wins for a featherweight like Rick Glenn is unbelievable, because he's tall, he's long, he's lanky, but again, unlike Cole Miller, who uses that tall, lanky to try to get you wrapped up in submissions, Rick Glenn uses that height and length to hit you with big strikes, kicks, knees, punches. He's one of the best underrated strikers at 145 pounds. Gavin Tucker is 1-0 in the UFC. While he's 10-0, 9 of his wins come on the regional circuit, and his only UFC win is against Sam Celia, who's no longer in the UFC. He was a journeyman in the UFC, sub 500 record. Now he's gone. So, I mean, I don't know that we know anything about Gavin Tucker at this point. What I do know I'm getting with Rick Glenn is a huge featherweight who can punch, who knows how to use his height and reach at a price of plus 240. I have not only did I bet this play, I bet it a couple of times. This is a double bet for me, despite the fact that it's a plus 240 underdog. A lot of people just jump on these favorites. They go, this guy's 10-0, he's minus 300. This conclusion feels like a foregone conclusion. Not the case here. I love the 240 underdog. One of my favorite plays of this entire card, and I expect Rick Glenn to come in and get the KO finish here in this fight. And speaking of that finish, when you look at the total on this fight, 2.5 over minus 220. We just said Rick Glenn has 10 knockouts and 19 wins. You add that to the 4 submissions he have. This guy has a 75% finish rate, and yet we're laying 220 that this fight goes the distance. We haven't seen Gavin Tucker's chin tested because he hasn't fought anyone with a chin, and we don't know what he can, what his gas tank's like. He's fought on the regional scene. Not only do I love the underdog at plus 220 here in Rick Glenn, I also like the under in this fight, and I think it's worth a look. At plus $2, under 2.5. This isn't under 1.5. Basically, you're getting 2-1 that this fight doesn't go the distance, and one of the fighters, the established guy that we know, has a 75% finish rate. I love Rick Glenn at plus 240. It's one of my favorite plays on the card, but I also would suggest to people take a look at this under at plus 220. Both of these guys finish a heck of a lot more fights than they don't. At 2-1 odds, it seems like a great value. I kind of left the rest of the fight alone, Mitch Clark and Alex White. The only reason I thought maybe Mitch Clark had a little bit of value here is, A, he has a lot better resume. He's fought a lot of tough guys in the UFC. But not only that, is as we saw on the UFC card in Mexico a few weeks ago, where I was on the fortune end of 2 hometown decisions on that fight, you get the Canadian here and Mitch Clark fighting on his home turf, fighting in front of his home crowd. We've seen how it sways judges, especially in international cards. It tends to sway judges more outside the U.S. for whatever reason than it does in the U.S. Mitch Clark certainly going to have the hometown crowd here. And at plus 160, I thought this fight was actually a little bit closer than the odds suggested. Anyway, when you factor in the hometown crowd with this one, if it ends up going the distance, I think there's a really strong case to be made that Mitch Clark at plus 160 could certainly be a bet here. Another underdog I looked at, Arjan Bhullar, a minus 190 favorite against Luis Henrique da Silva. Arjan Bhullar, a guy we know nothing about, right? He's 6-0, most of his wins on the regional scene. He's a kind of a big round guy. He's not a tall, strong heavyweight. More round than ripped, let's just put it that. More round than ripped, that's how we'll call it. Against the guy in Luis Henrique da Silva, who I know I've seen a few times, has huge knockout power. And when it comes to heavyweights, we all know it only takes one punch. I don't know anything about Bhullar. I do know a little bit about Henrique da Silva. I've seen him fight in the UFC a couple of times. He doesn't have the best gas tank. He doesn't have the best technique, and he's not great on the ground. But when he winds that big right hand up, he can knock anybody in the UFC out. At plus 160, this feels like another underdog. I get the experienced guy, get a more established guy who's fought tougher guys. I feel like the odds here more indicate the record of the two fighters than the experience level and the resume of the two fighters. I think this fight is a little bit closer to a pick'em than the odds might suggest. Maybe plus 160 on Luis Henrique da Silva, a good value. I left the other women's fight alone. Ashley Evans-Smith, currently a minus 250 favorite. 2.5 over minus 240 here at the CGT Sportsbooks at the Palms Resort and Casino, Las Vegas. I didn't really have a strong opinion in this fight. Both of these women, to me, have underwhelming resumes, underwhelming performances. I certainly wouldn't suggest laying 250 with Ashley Evans-Smith, but Sara McMann hasn't shown anything to make me want to back her either with my hard-earned money. And then Cajun Johnson, Adriano Martins. This is a fight I actually made minus 500. The odds are currently minus 450 with a round total of 1.5, under minus 140 here at the CGT Sportsbooks at the Palms, Las Vegas. This is a fight Adriano Martins should win easily. This is a guy who's been in there with anybody who's everybody in the lightweight division, and he should run through Cajun Johnson. But it's another situation. Do you want to lay minus 450? Because we've seen Adriano Martins on the wrong end plenty of times, although against much tougher than Cajun Johnson. If you're looking for something to fill a parlay, if you just want to throw another fight in there, Adrian Martins does feel like a safe bet. I just can't I can't justify laying that price with a guy who's lost as many, with double-digit losses, basically, like Martins has. That's basically the UFC 215 card here in a recap. I think we can look that there could be some inherent value here in Ray Borg, 24 years old, could be hitting his prime, could be primed for a big effort here. If the odds were minus 300 or minus 400 on DJ, we certainly wouldn't be looking at Ray Borg, but at minus 1100 plus 700, certainly may be worth taking a look. And again, with Ray Borg, what we want to do is watch the weigh-in tomorrow. This is a guy who has missed weight badly in the past at 125. Let's see how he looks tomorrow. Does he look drained? Does he look strong? How was the weight cut? Because if he looks good making the weight, there's probably some value at plus 700. If he looks drained, then there could be some value in the under 4.5 rounds, because the guy probably can't go the distance if he had a really hard weight cut. So I think the weight cut is everything as far as what you need to bet in the main event. Let's all make sure we watch that weigh-in tomorrow and see what Ray Borg looks like. Get as much information as we can on what kind of weight cut Ray Borg had, and then bet that main event accordingly after that. The co-main event, 5 rounds, UFC women's bantamweight title fight. I think you have to love Amanda Nunes here. She closed as the favorite last time they fought. She beat Shevchenko first time they fought. And the only reason I feel like there's this wave of Shevchenko action now is there's a little bit of disdain for Amanda Nunes after she pulled out fight night last time they were supposed to fight. Ignore that. Expect Amanda Nunes to be at 100%. Take her at the very generous underdog price. Neil Magny, another underdog we were looking at for a lot of reasons we discussed earlier. Gilbert Melendez in a desperation spot against Jeremy Stephens, a big bet for me. Kind of looking at Caitlin Vieira. Wouldn't want to lay minus 260 with Sara McMann, so maybe a small play on Caitlin Vieira there. I left Henry Cejudo, Wilson Heiss alone. Henry Cejudo, a minus 340 favorite, 2.5 with a total of over, minus 270. It feels like a fight Henry Cejudo should win. But the problem is I could see Henry Cejudo wrestling him down. Wilson Heiss really good in the scrambles. I don't want to lay it with this. I don't want to take it with Heiss either. Heiss scares me just enough with his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that I didn't want to take Henry Cejudo here at the big favorite price. Rick Glenn, plus 240 underdog against Gavin Tucker. One of my favorite picks of this card. Maybe take a peek at the under 2.5 rounds there as well. Mitch Clark, the hometown crowd at plus 160. And Luis Henrique da Silva looking to land that big right hand early in round 1 maybe and score you some money as a plus 160 underdog as well. That's it for UFC 215. We got some great cards coming up. Look, we have cards almost every single week the rest of the year. We've been on an unbelievable run making money here in the UFC. Let's keep that run going. Look, last week, Alexander Volkov, we gave it out. Best bet. Love this play. He gets home. Easy money again, continuing the run this year. I would tell you how much money we're up this year, but then my wife would come a-calling. That's it for UFC 215, this week's episode of The Final Round.